Hey guys, before tonight's journey begins, take a little time to settle in. Find a position that lets your body feel at ease and soften anywhere that feels tight. Let your shoulders drop naturally and slowly begin to set down the tiredness you've carried through the whole of the day. Tonight, we'll follow a single day in the life of a young woman in a small English town during the Victorian age. From the early morning quiet of the house before the world has stepped inside, through calls and letters and the long evening of a ball, to the countless tiny unspoken rules that shape her every hour. There's nothing here you need to hold on to tightly. The story moves at the pace of a breath meant only to carry you gently towards sleep. If these quiet journeys help you rest, we warmly welcome you to follow this channel, so that another night like this one can find you when you need it. A quiet like, or a few words left below telling us where you're listening from tonight, can help other people discover these stories. None of it has to be done now. It can wait until morning, or it can wait forever. For the moment, none of this asks anything of you at all. Right now, there's only the warmth around you, the slow arrival of the night, and a long, gentle story waiting to begin. If your eyes want to close, then let them close. Let your breathing slow, and when you're ready, we'll step softly into a quiet house in the first faint light of morning, before the day has asked anything of anyone. I'd like to take you back to a small English town in the spring of 1863. May had come to Oldenburg, and with it came the social season, those few bright months when the front doors of the town would be answered a little more quickly, when the best rooms would be aired and dusted, and when the young woman of a certain household was quietly expected to begin her entrance into society. Her name we'll come to in a while. For now it's enough to know that she was 19, that this was the first season she'd take part in fully as a grown woman, and that almost everything she'd do today was already, in a way, decided. It wasn't arranged by anyone she could see, there was no list pinned to the wall and no voice giving orders, and yet the hours ahead of her were being shaped certainly and surely by thousands of tiny rules that no one had ever written down, but that somehow everyone expected her to know, as though those lists and those orders truly did exist. I think this is the strange and tender thing about her world, and it's what I hope we can feel together tonight. The rules were everywhere. How long a morning call might last, which card should be left on the tray, and how the corner of that card should be turned down, who she could greet in the street, and who she must walk past as though she were passing an empty road, where her hand should rest at the table and where her eyes should fall in the ballroom. To those of us looking back, it can seem like a great deal of care spent on things that hardly matter, but to her, and to the women who taught her, it was more like a language, a way of saying without a single plain word that she understood how to carry herself in this world and could be trusted within it. So let's stand beside her through this ordinary day and see how that language works. We'll watch the house wake before she does. We'll follow the little tray that carries the names of visitors and the quiet time she spends at her writing desk. We'll step out of the door with her, beneath a parasol, into a street that gently studies her as she passes. When the lamps are lit, we'll sit at a long table laden with more silver than a single pair of hands could ever need. And then, when the music sounds its first note, we'll stand at the edge of a floor polished until it shines. If it were you, the first thing you'd notice is how many eyes are watching and how kindly all that watching turns into a kind of ease once you've learnt the rules. That's the part worth pausing over. Not its strictness, but the quiet safety a young woman could find within it, once these rules became as natural to her as her own breathing. None of this needs to be rushed. In the day ahead, nothing will startle you and nothing needs to be remembered. Let the town settle around you, its low chimneys, its damp spring gardens, and the smell of a house opening itself to a new day. And so, before she wakes, let's go inside. In the first grey light, let's step into the stillness of her home, while the fire has only just been laid, and the long, well-ordered day sits folded and waiting quietly to begin. While it's still dark, come inside, and before anyone has thought to light a lamp for you, stand in the front hall of this house. The air here is cold with that particular chill a house holds before dawn. A stillness that has settled into the floorboards through the night, and that needs hours of living to warm it through. Somewhere above you, a ticking clock keeps patient time. Everything else is hushed and quiet. The house isn't fully asleep, for under a door at the far end of the passage there's a thin line of light, and behind that door someone is already awake. Her name is Nellie, the maid of the house. She's the first person here to meet the day, just as she is every day she works here, rising in the dark while the family still sleeps upstairs. In the small back kitchen she lights her own candle, and by its light she ties a rough apron over her printed dress and gathers the things she needs. A tin of black lead, a brush with edges worn soft, a cloth, a bucket, and a handful of damp tea leaves left from yesterday, scattered over the carpet before sweeping because they catch the dust and carry it away. She moves without hurry and without a sound, for a good maid learns early that the comfort of the whole household rests on her being neither seen nor heard before she's needed. She kneels before the first fireplace of the morning. Yesterday's ashes lie grey and cold in the grate, and she clears them out with slow, practised movements, her hands having done the very same thing 10,000 times before. Then comes the blacking, rubbing the black lead into the iron until it gives off a dull sheen. Then the laying of the new fire. First the paper, then the kindling cross precisely, and finally the coal set on top with a care that looks almost like tenderness. A fire laid badly will smoulder, smoke and die. A fire laid well will catch at the touch of a match and burn clean all through the morning. There's real skill in it that no one in the house will see, and that few will ever think to thank her for. With the fireplace done, she carries on with the rounds of the hour that follows. The shutters are folded back, the curtains drawn open, letting in as much light as they can. The carpet is swept, the hearth is wiped, and the fender and poker are polished until they shine bright enough to hold the light of the new fire. Outside the front door, the steps are scrubbed pale, so that the first thing the morning's first visitor sets foot on is clean. For a dirty doorstep is something the whole street can read at a single glance. The rooms of the front hall are dusted in order, each ornament lifted, and then set back exactly where it has always stood. She works from the top of a room downward, and from the point furthest from the door toward the door itself, so that a place already cleaned is never dirtied a second time. None of this is written in any book she owns. It was learned by watching and by doing, and it has become the shape of every one of her mornings. Before that cold fireplace in the grey light, let's stay a little longer than the moment itself seems to us. When we look back at a house like this, it's easy to see only the family, the 19-year-old young lady and the aunt who guides her, and to let everyone else melt into the background of the walls. But this house belongs to Nellie too, and to the other servants below stairs, whose mornings begin far earlier than the family's. History has left almost no trace of a girl like her. We don't know her real name, we don't know where she came from, and we don't know what she was thinking as she knelt there in the dark. What we do know is that the warmth the family feels when they wake, the bright fire, the aired rooms, and the kettle coming to the boil was all quietly made by her hands before the day had truly begun. Before we go upstairs, I think that's worth a small pause here. If you let yourself feel it, there's a certain calm in work like this. The same rooms, the same fireplaces, the same slow round of tasks day after day. To us it might look like drudgery, and in many ways it truly is hard. But there's something steadying in it too, in knowing exactly what this hour needs of you, and in doing it well. As she moves through it, the shape of the house grows clearer around her. One room warms, and then the next. One set of curtains is drawn from a pale window, and then the next. Slowly the darkness turns into morning. Downstairs she isn't alone, though the others are only now beginning to stir. There's the cook, who'll soon build the fire high and set the porridge to cook, and who rules the kitchen as surely as the mistress rules upstairs. There's a boy named Tom, who carries the coal, cleans the shoes, and runs any errand he's told to, who eats a great deal and grows quickly so that letting out the seams of his clothes can hardly keep pace with him. Before they carry the family's breakfast up the stairs, they'll gather around the scrub kitchen table to eat their own, a plain and hurried meal, for the day's work is already pressing close. It's a whole small household beneath the household, with its own order and its own hours running quietly out of sight so that the rooms upstairs seem to keep themselves running all on their own. Meanwhile, upstairs, the family was beginning to stir, and here we meet the person who truly set the order of this house. Mrs. Cornelia Ashby was not the girl's mother, for that lady had died many years ago. She was the girl's aunt, a widow, come to keep house for her brother and to make sure his daughter passed safely through her first few seasons of stepping into society. She rose early and she took pride in it. To her, the habit of getting up with the morning light was not merely a matter of convenience, but almost a kind of virtue, a small proof that a person could master her own day. She had said as much to her niece more than once. She believed that a day which began late could never be caught up again. There was more than simple briskness behind this belief, and it's worth our while to understand it. In her world, in the books of teaching she'd grown up with, rising early was bound up with health, with thrift, and even with character itself. The morning hours were thought to be the time when the body was healthiest and the mind clearest, and those who let those hours slip away while lying in bed were thought to be squandering the finest part of the day, and only one step short of squandering the finest part of themselves. Whether or not the doctors of the time were right in every detail, the belief had taken deep root, and a girl absorbed it long before she was able to argue against it. Sleeping late was not merely laziness. In a way, it was a small flaw upon the whole person, and so, while the little town outside was still trying to shake off its drowsiness, Mrs. Ashby was already dressed and moving about upstairs, and her niece, Adelaide Marlowe, was being gently encouraged to do the same. Adelaide Marlowe was 19, and this was the first spring in which all the machinery of grown-up society opened fully before her. If she had been left to herself, she could easily have slept another hour without any trouble at all. But she said nothing. One of the earliest lessons she had learned that year was that many of her own small preferences were to be quietly kept in check and never spoken of, and rising on time was foremost among them. During these first hours, what she wore was not yet the lady's dress meant for receiving guests. It was a morning gown, a loose sort of robe, easy and comfortable to wear, cut from washable material, printed cotton or soft muslin in the warm months, and a warmer fabric when the weather turned cool. On her feet she wore embroidered cloth shoes, soft and silent upon the floor. Over the gown she might tie a large apron of plain checked cloth, which protected the front of the robe while she busied herself with the lighter duties of the morning. This was one of those small unwritten rules of the time that shaped her. The apron was chosen not only because it was practical, but because it could be slipped off in a moment. If a visitor happened to call, if a neighbour came early on some errand, the apron came off and the morning gown beneath was decent enough to receive them without any loss of dignity. In fact, on a morning when many visitors were expected and much housework was to be done, a lady might go one step further. First put on the dress meant for receiving guests, then throw over a loose check jacket and a plain work overskirt, which could be stripped off the instant a visitor was announced. It was a clever two-layered way of dressing, with the respectable side ready underneath, and the working side lightly buttoned on top. I rather admire the cleverness of it. There was nothing grand about a checked overskirt, but it let a woman hold two states at once, busy and ready, without ever being caught out in the wrong role. Much of a lady's dressing was built upon this quiet principle of being ready at all times. I'd like to linger on this small arrangement a moment longer, because it tells us the whole shape of her daily life. Even here, in the private morning of her own home, before she had even had her breakfast, she was already half prepared to be looked at. The line between private and public was drawn differently then than it is now. Yes, a lady's morning belonged to her household, but this time was never entirely her own. At any moment the world might knock in the form of a visitor, and she was expected to be found in a state that wouldn't embarrass her. To us this may sound like a kind of pressure, a watchfulness that never fully relaxed. And to her, it was simply the air and water she lived by, learned so early that it no longer even felt like a rule. It felt like being dressed properly. In its own way, it felt like safety. Her hair, too, was seen to early. She was still young enough that she did not need to cover her hair with a cap in the morning, as married women often did, and as some girls had lately begun to imitate. But Mrs. Ashby told her that the fashion for wearing a cap was often an excuse to hide hair that had not been properly dressed, and that under her roof she'd never allow such a thing. She said that spending a little time each morning to comb the hair into a neat and orderly part was by no means a waste of time, and so Adelaide sat before the mirror, drawing the comb through her hair until it lay smoothly and parted neatly down the middle. And having done this small task, she was ready to go downstairs. Downstairs, the order of the household was being handed over from Nellie's hands into Mrs. Ashby's. At this hour each morning, the aunt would move through the rooms of the front hall with a calm, examining eye, checking whether the fires had been lit, whether the curtains hung smooth and even, whether a trace of yesterday's dust had lingered to greet the day. This was not because she distrusted the servants. It was because the running of a household was understood to be the art of the lady of the house, and a well-ordered home would be taken by everyone who stepped into it as a portrait of the woman who kept it. Nothing needed to be said aloud. A visitor stepping into a cold or neglected room would naturally draw her own conclusions, and those conclusions had their own ways of spreading. There were rules, too, about how a mistress should treat those who served her, and Mrs. Ashby had her own settled opinions on the matter. She was neither harsh nor overly familiar, and she thought these two faults were nearer to each other than most people supposed. She believed that a mistress who scolded and found fault all day only got worse service for it, and a mistress who dropped all distance and treated her maid as a confidant fared no better. The right way lay between the two, a manner that was kind but steady, firm but never cold. She would say that if you took the servants' comfort into account, the servants would take yours into account as well. To be a quiet, reasonable person toward those beneath you in rank, and not to forget that they too grew tired at the end of a long day. In this way, even hard tasks could be made bearable. There was a good deal of warmth in this, and a good deal of shrewdness too, and the two were really inseparable. I don't wish to make Mrs. Ashby out to be someone she was not. She lived comfortably upon the labour of people who worked hard for small wages, and she thought nothing strange about it, because scarcely anyone of her station did. That was the world she'd been given. But within that world, she tried in her own way to be decent, and taught her niece to be decent too. And there was an effort in that which is worth respecting even today. Kindness within a household of unequal rank is not the same thing as fairness. But it is by no means meaningless either. The family gathered for breakfast and the real business of the morning began, which was the arranging of the day's life. Between the teacups and the covered dishes, Mrs. Ashby and the cook decided what was to be eaten and what was to be bought, for this was the moment for taking stock of the household's needs. It was now May, and the market had begun to offer the gifts of spring, the first tender greens, the early vegetables, and the fish that were plump now and would grow dear a month later. What was in season and what was out of it, what must be sent for and what could wait a while longer, what had been left over from yesterday and how it might be quietly turned into a new dish. For a good table lay not only in abundance but in thrift as well, and waste in the kitchen was seen as a small kind of disgrace. Adelaide was meant to sit by, listening and learning. One day her own house would turn upon exactly such decisions as these. A wife who did not understand the managing of a kitchen would not be thought much of a wife, however sweetly she played the piano. She did not find this terribly exciting. Few girls of 19 ever do, but she'd begun to catch a dim sight of its shape, how a whole household kept running smoothly through 100 small forethought acts, most of them unseen, most of them coming from a woman's hands. The accounts to be kept, the stores to be watched over, the orders given today so that dinner might appear a few hours later, as though of its own accord. I think this is the quiet thing worth taking away from the early morning. Much of what we have observed is plain, even to the point of being dull. The grate blacked in the dark, the apron chosen because it could be quickly slipped off, the shopping list for dinner. These are not the sort of things that are remembered, written into history, or left in old-fashioned romantic novels for people to sigh over. And yet this is the very ground on which everything else stands. Those visits, letters, dinners and balls, all those bright and elegant hours that were coming, were all built upon a house that had been made ready before the sun had fully risen. There is a comfort in this steadiness, the comfort of feeling a world being gently set right by pairs of hands that ask for no attention, through one small task after another. Outside, the daylight had grown bright, and the town had woken. Somewhere a carriage passed by. The best rooms had been aired and tidied. The fires burned clean. and on the table in the front hall a small tray waited quietly, still empty for now, ready to receive the names the day would bring. The house had opened its doors to the day. Its long and orderly hours lay quietly ahead, still folded, still waiting, like a letter not yet unsealed. Take a look at that little tray waiting on the hall table. It is an unassuming small thing, silver or silver-plated, polished to a shine by Nellie's cloth, and at this moment it holds only a card or two left over from yesterday. Before the whole morning is out, it will have gathered many more. As you pass it in the hall, you might think it hardly worth a second glance, nothing but a dish for odds and ends. In truth, it is one of the busiest tools in the house, and across its polished surface flows a great deal of the coming and going of a lady's social life, an exchange carried on almost entirely by these small rectangles of stiff pasteboard, and read as carefully as one reads a letter. Pick up one of Adelaide's own cards and turn it over between your fingers. It is not large. Her name is engraved upon it in a plain, clear typeface, without any fancy flourish, for anything ornate was thought to be showy and a little vulgar, and the whole art of the thing lay in a restrained good taste. Because she is young and unmarried, the name upon it reads Miss Marlowe. She keeps this little stack of cards in a card case, and wherever she goes to call, that case goes with her, as necessary as her gloves and her parasol. A lady without her cards is a lady caught wholly unprepared, and in such a careful little world, being unprepared is a thing to be avoided. There is something almost touching in an object so slight, carrying so much weight. A card is only paper. It is worth next to nothing. It might be dropped, or bent, or lost down the side of a chair, and yet a single scrap of paper like this might decide the whole course of a friendship, opening it, keeping it up, cooling it, or quietly bringing it to an end, and all of that without a single word spoken aloud. I am rather fond of the cleverness in it. A society found in a thing printed with a simple name, a way to say a great many things it would rather not say to anyone's face. We are not so very different ourselves. We too have our own small objects that carry more meaning than they seem to on the surface, but few of ours are so finely made, or managed with such precision. The card has a grammar of its own, and Adelaide spent the whole spring learning it. The first thing a card can do is simply to say, "I have been here." When a lady calls and finds the mistress of the house not at home, or not free to receive visitors, she does not go away empty-handed, and let the visit come to nothing. She leaves her card. The card stays there in her place, a small paper proof that she has done her duty and shown the kindly thought. To leave a card is to keep up a connection. To fail to leave one when it was owed is to let the thread of that connection go slack, and a thread gone slack before very long will break. Then there is the matter of the turned corner. If the lady herself left the card at the door in person, she would fold down one corner of it as a mark. When the household comes to look over the tray, that little folded triangle tells them that she herself stood upon their step, and did not merely send a servant round with a handful of cards to scatter about like handbills. A folded corner is a sign of respect, a proof of trouble taken. There are other folds, other silent signals, a card to offer sympathy in a time of sorrow, a card to say goodbye before a journey, each with its own small convention. To someone raised from childhood in this world, the tray at the end of the morning can be read almost like a page in a book. It tells who came in person, who merely sent word, and with what feeling behind it. The look of a card speaks its own silent language too. A lady's card is a little larger than a gentleman's, and there's a good taste of the day leaned toward the plain. Fine paper, a clear typeface, no gilding, no ornament, nothing that tries too hard. A card that shows off is a card that has entirely missed the point of the thing, and for those in a season of mourning, the edge of the card would be bordered with a narrow band of black, so that even before a single word had passed between them, the household knew to receive them gently. The paper speaks first, and the living take their cue from it. Even the number of cards to be left and to whom has its own strict arithmetic. A married lady calling would leave her own card for the mistress of the house, and perhaps her husband's card as well, one for the lady, one for the gentleman, since a man's social duties were often carried out for him in this way, through a wife who remembered such things on his behalf. Adelaide, as an unmarried girl, had a far simpler task. But she watched her aunt at every door, counting out the little slips of paper with the quiet attention of an accountant. The smallest slip here, one card too few, or a card left where none should have been, would be noticed. And it would say something she never meant to say. A young lady cannot simply begin calling wherever she likes either. There is also the question of who calls upon whom first, and that is not for the newcomer to decide. When a household is newly arrived in a neighbourhood, they must wait. It falls to the older residents there to call upon them first, and so open the door to acquaintance, and only after that first call has been received may a return call be made. To come uninvited, to leave your card in a place where no one has yet left a card for you, would be thought forward, and for a girl, being forward is a serious mistake. So Adelaide learned to wait, to let herself be called upon, and to answer only the olive branch that another had held out. She found that a great part of her social life lay in knowing when it was not yet her turn. Once someone has called upon you, you must call back, and within a proper length of time. The usual measure was a week or so. To leave it too long before returning the call is a small discourtesy, a sign that you do not much value the acquaintance. But the manner of the return call can speak as loudly as its promptness. To return the call in person, the lady herself coming to sit a while, is warm. To have a servant merely deliver a card by way of a return is cooler, correct as far as manners go, but no more than that, a way of keeping up the connection at arm's length. A whole friendship is tended in these fine shades, or gently let go, and everyone concerned understood it perfectly, though no one ever spelled it out. It is not only after a duty that a card is owed, but after a pleasure as well. If a lady is invited to a dinner, a ball, or a musical evening, she cannot simply enjoy it and put it out of her mind. Within a few days she must call, or at the very least leave her card to show her thanks. This small return lets the social circle close up whole again. It shows that the kindness has been felt and will be remembered. To be entertained at someone's house and then, a week gone by, to send no card, pay no call, make no sign at all is as good as taking that fine evening for granted. Nothing could cool a hostess more quickly than that. There were rules for the gentleman too, though these touched Adelaide only at a careful distance. A gentleman might leave his card for a household, and after a time might be allowed to call. But a young unmarried woman could not receive a gentleman's call as freely as she would receive another lady. Such a call was made upon the household, not upon the girl. The receiving of it wanted her aunt present, in the open drawing-room, in the bright light of the afternoon. A card left by a gentleman would be noticed, and weighed, and quietly talked over afterward. For a card passed from that direction might be the small first step of some matter, as everyone well knew. Adelaide knew it best of all, and she said nothing, and left her aunt to weigh it. Take that little card case in your hand once more, and feel how light it is, smooth leather perhaps, or made of mother of pearl, small enough to hide in the palm of a hand. Inside lies a neat stack of cards, cool and stiff to the touch. A lady draws one out with 2 gloved fingers. She does it without looking, in one practised motion. It seems a trifling little skill, but she has done it 1,000 times, and will do it 1,000 more, and in that ease there is a quiet grace. You might ask why anyone would build so elaborate a machinery out of scraps of paper and folded corners. Seen from this distance in history, it can look a touch absurd, but beneath its surface there was a real need. And once you understand that need, the whole thing seems far less strange. In a town of any size, the social circle had grown too large for everyone to know everyone. A lady might have a great many acquaintances, far too many to sit down face to face with each one as often as courtesy seemed to demand. The card solved that. It let her exchange a greeting with 100 people without having to actually call upon 100 people. It let nearness and distance be carefully measured. A little warmth here, a little coolness there, and it let a woman manage her delicate, tangled web of acquaintance without ever having to speak one word that was unkind or overly eager. In its own curious way, it was in truth a labour-saving thing and a keeper of the peace. The morning call had officially begun, and the cards were only half of the matter. Many ladies would set aside one fixed day each week to receive visitors, an afternoon that all their friends knew about, so that a caller could arrive feeling sure of a welcome rather than finding the door closed to her. On the days kept for calling, a lady would go out to pay her visits in person, and Adelaide went along with her aunt, learning by watching and doing right there at her side. They set out in an orderly way, gloved, neatly dressed, and with their card cases ready. They went first to those households where they owed a return visit, because the whole system ran on a gentle sort of bookkeeping of attention, where what you gave and what you received had to be settled. If you fell behind on that account, you would seem to care too little for your friends. At the door they asked whether the lady of the house was free to receive visitors. A servant took down their names, or accepted their cards and carried them upstairs. If the mistress was not at home, or not free to receive, they left a card and moved on to the next house, having done their duty without troubling anyone. But if she was free to receive them, they were shown upstairs, and at the drawing room door their names were announced, so that the lady of the house had a moment to prepare and to know who had come to call. Here the true little performance of the morning call began. It was a short ceremony, and it was meant to be exactly that. A morning call was never a long sitting. 15 minutes was thought to be just right, and half an hour was the very highest limit that manners allowed, because the caller had to remember that the lady she was visiting had other visits to expect and had her own whole morning to manage as well. To sink too comfortably into a chair and let the time stretch out was surely one of the clearest signs that a person did not quite understand the rules of the game. They did not take off their outer things, the shawl stayed over the shoulders, the bonnet stayed on, the gloves stayed on, and all of it quietly said, "I will not stay long. I know my visit is a short one." These small things let the caller rise and leave without any fuss when the time came. The conversation, too, stayed light and pleasant, like the small change that passes from hand to hand each day. The weather, a concert, the health of a friend they had in common. Nothing heavy, nothing that could not be picked up and set down again within that brief pause. And when a second visitor was announced and shown in, that was often a natural signal that the first visitor should say her goodbyes, giving up her chair and the share of the hostess's attention she had held, and going on to the next name on her list. Within this system there was a small kindness that I have always liked. When the servant said the lady of the house was not at home, it did not always mean the house was empty. It might mean only that she was not free to receive at that moment. Perhaps she was tired. Perhaps she was busy or unwell, or simply wanted an hour to herself. That phrase let her turn away a visit without giving offence and without forcing anyone to speak an awkward truth. The caller understood this. She left her card, moved on, and no one was hurt. It was a polite fiction that everyone quietly agreed to. There is something gentle in a world that built for itself a soft way of saying, not just now, if it were you stepping into that drawing room for the first time with a case holding your own new cards. I think your body would feel all of this before your mind ever understood it. That little flutter in your chest at the door, not knowing what sort of welcome you would meet, sitting carefully, talking easily, and not letting yourself say too much. Keeping an eye on the clock out of the corner of your eye so as not to flee too soon or linger too long. And then that small, real sense of relief at parting, when you stood on the steps again and the visit was safely over and well done. There is something in all of this that has not changed at all. Anyone who has ever made a short, slightly nervous social visit, counting the minutes until they could decently bring it to a close, can feel exactly what Adelaide felt in any century. This is the gentleness hidden inside all the elaborate machinery of cards and turned corners and precise timing. From the outside it looks cold, like a society that cared more about form than about feeling. But the forms existed to carry the feeling, not to replace it. They gave a shy, uncertain girl a script she could follow. They let people who did not know one another well meet without awkwardness and part without offence. They saved everyone the strain of having to work out fresh each time how they ought to behave. A rule made with kindness in mind and followed gently can be a kind of shelter. Adelaide did not always love these rules, but I would guess that on certain mornings she was quietly grateful for them. Grateful that they held her up and told her where to stand. We imagine the morning call to be a graceful thing, all tea and easy talk. But a whole round of calls was a piece of work. It meant walking from house to house across the town or riding in a carriage. It meant standing, sitting, rising and standing again. It meant keeping a pleasant face and a light voice for hours on end, through call after call even when your feet already ached and you longed to be home sooner. In the social season, a busy lady might make so many of these visits that we would hardly believe the number. Behind all that grace lay real labour. And for Adelaide, so new to it, the labour was felt more than the grace, at least for now. By the time the two of them turned back toward home, the morning round of calls was nearly finished, and other ladies had been out making their own calls during that same time. So when Adelaide and her aunt returned to their own hall, the little silver tray was no longer empty. On it lay the cards of visitors who had come while they were out, some with a corner turned down, arranged there in order of arrival by Nellie as each one appeared. Mrs. Ashby stopped to look them over, just as she did every day. She read that small paper record of who had thought of them that morning, and of whom they must soon think of in return. This was the quiet daytime ledger of friendship kept in stiff cardboard. These cards would rest for a while on the bright tray in the cool hall, a small heap of names whose hands had already gone elsewhere. Each one stood for a visit completed, or a thoughtful greeting. It was a thread kept whole. The house was quiet again for a spell, the visitors gone, the morning's little traffic of names all gathered in and written down, and the tray waited, as it always did, for the next person who had come to call. The calls, paused for now, were over, and the cards were cooling on the tray. Adelaide had come back inside with the whole morning's chatter still turning in her mind. She had said little, but she had listened a great deal. Without anyone teaching her, she was beginning to work out for herself that in this world, conversation was not simply a matter of opening your mouth and letting the words spill out. It was governed by a set of rules that were in some ways as precise as the ones for placing cards on a tray, only quieter and harder to notice. Let us sit with her for a moment in the drawing room, with the curtains drawn back and the noonday sun pouring in, and think over what she had learned. Of all the invisible laws that shaped her daily life, the rules of speech were perhaps the most delicate, the easiest to break without meaning to, and the hardest to mend once broken. A card left wrongly could be corrected the next morning, but an unfortunate word, once it was spoken, hung there in the air and would not fade for a long while. The first rule was the simplest and the one most often repeated: a lady must not talk too much. To our ears, that sounds like an order to keep quiet, a way of holding women down. In some measure it truly was, but the reasoning behind it was more practical than it first appears. In a room full of people, conversation was thought to be a shared thing. It belonged to no single person. A woman who chattered on and would not give up her hold on the talk was not admired for her cleverness. People only pitied her for her lack of feeling for others, because she had not noticed that the rest of them wished to speak as well. Mrs. Ashby would say that the art of talking lay not in having something to say, but in knowing when to speak and when to wait. The best talkers were thought to be the best listeners, the ones who could draw others out and make them feel heard, the ones who asked a gentle question to open a door, rather than filling the whole room with their own words. There is something in this that we have not entirely shaken off even now. At any gathering, we still notice the person who listens well, and we still feel a small pulling back from the one who does not. The words have changed, the principle has not. In any century, to listen with real attention, to let another finish, to make them feel their words were worth hearing, is still a kindness. What was different from Adelaide's day was that in her time this kindness had been written into a rule, and the one who enforced that rule was not any particular person, but the silent shared judgment of everyone in the room. A girl who talked too much became afterward the thing that others talked about, and that was punishment enough. There were also subjects a lady must not touch, and it is surprising how firmly people held to these forbidden things. She must not speak ill of anyone who was absent. She must not repeat a secret told to her in private. She must not press on a point of disagreement until she made the other person uncomfortable. She must not speak of money, not the price of things, not another person's income, not what someone's house or gown or carriage might be worth. She must not go on at length about illness, whether her own or anyone else's. She must not bring up religion to argue over, nor politics to quarrel about, because these subjects were thought to heat the blood and spoil the easy mood of the room. Above all, she must not gossip, though of course gossip was everywhere, and the line between harmless news and unkind talk was never quite as clear as the etiquette books pretended. There was another, more subtle prohibition, one that Mrs. Ashby never scolded about out loud, yet enforced strictly. A lady must never talk about her servants in a social setting. She couldn't complain about a maid's clumsiness, couldn't boast about the cook's talents, and couldn't share the little domestic dramas of the kitchen in a drawing room full of guests. The servants were part of the house, and the workings of the house were private. To speak of these things in front of visitors was considered vulgar, for it showed that a woman couldn't keep her own world in order without begging a whole room for sympathy. During the first few weeks after Adelaide began going out into society, she once casually mentioned something Nellie had done that morning, a piece of innocent, harmless chatter with no malice in it. Mrs. Ashby gave her a single glance, and that was enough. She never made the same mistake again. Humour too had its dangers, and Adelaide was learning to steer carefully around those hidden rocks. A witty remark could light up an entire room. But that barbed sort of cleverness, the kind that made a joke of someone else, was considered worse than being dull, because dullness harmed no one. Sarcasm was especially offensive. It was thought to be the lowest and most wounding kind of humour, because it said one thing while meaning another, leaving the person it was aimed at unable to answer back without seeming to lack a sense of humour. A pun might perhaps be forgiven, though it wasn't much admired. Good-natured teasing among old friends might get by, but any words that left a sting behind would be remembered, and the woman who made a habit of wounding others with her tongue would sooner or later find the whole room quietly turned against her. Even when repeating what someone else had said, there was a rule. If Adelaide wanted to mention something she'd heard in conversation, she had to choose her words carefully. She couldn't say, "Mrs. Wren told me that," unless Mrs. Wren had made it clear she wished the thing to be passed along. A better way of saying it was, "I've heard about this," without naming names, so that no one would feel embarrassed at having their words travel farther than they'd meant. It was an extraordinarily fine, almost invisible sort of caution. But it meant that even an idle talk, even the most harmless exchange about a concert or a hat, had to be handled as gently as something that might easily break. Looking at this list, what surprised me wasn't how much was forbidden, but how much still remained open. A woman could talk about books, about music, about places she'd been or wished to go. As long as she kept it short and didn't make herself the hero of every story, she was quite free to tell a tale beautifully. As long as her humour didn't wound, she could be witty and clever too. She could ask about other people's interests and follow along with whatever they answered. In short, as long as she didn't parade her learning and never seemed to be showing off, she could be an interesting person, and society encouraged her to be one. In the eyes of the world she lived in, the gravest offence wasn't ignorance, it was showing off. A woman who flaunted her knowledge, who corrected a gentleman's Latin, or quoted at length from a book no one had read, would be thought to have mistaken the drawing room for a lecture hall. And the drawing room wasn't one to forgive that easily. Adelaide wasn't naturally a talkative person, and that made her task a little easier in some ways. She tended to sit quietly and observe, letting the conversation flow around her, joining in only when something caught her attention and drew her in. Mrs. Ashby didn't object to this, but she did offer one piece of advice. Don't stay skullant out of shyness and let others mistake it for coldness. Find something to say, even a trifling little thing, so that the people near you feel you are with them, and not merely enduring them. She told her niece that a warm word spoken at the right moment was worth more than an hour of endless chatter. Handling those who were tiresome required particular care. This was one of Mrs. Ashby's firmest teachings, and I found it rather admirable. When Adelaide sat beside someone who bored her, someone who spoke dully or was tedious company, she couldn't let it show on her face. She couldn't turn away in search of more interesting company. She had to stay and to try sincerely to find something in the person worth drawing out. Mrs. Ashby believed that everyone had something worth listening to, as long as you could find the door that opened them up. And even if you couldn't find it, the effort itself was a deeply profound kind of courtesy, almost a form of charity. The word charity seemed a little strange to place in a chapter about conversation. It belonged here, because what these rules truly asked of Adelaide wasn't brilliance, but a lasting generosity. Give your attention, listen, make room, let others feel that they matter. However tempting it might be, don't turn your tongue into a weapon, And don't turn your tongue into a flag to show off with. When needed, make it a bridge, joining you to the person across from you, letting something warmer than silence and gentler than an argument flow between you. Strip away the fussy formalities, and for any century at all, that isn't a bad teaching. Then came the rules about gentlemen who needed a set of laws all their own. Adelaide was taught to speak to men as easily and naturally as she spoke to women, but to stop before certain boundaries. She must never appear too familiar. She couldn't ask about his private affairs, his income, his prospects, or his family's debts. She couldn't flatter him openly, lest it be misread as a hint of something warmer than politeness. Under no circumstances could she allow the conversation to slide toward what might be called improper territory, which in practice meant any topic touching on the body, the bedroom, or any strong feeling. If a gentleman steered the talk in that direction, it was her duty to turn it back without a flicker, without causing any ripple, as though she hadn't heard it at all. This wasn't always easy. Some men would test the limits, saying things that hovered on the edge of what was proper, watching to see how a girl would react. A blush might be taken as consent, a laugh might be taken as an invitation. So Adelaide learned to keep her face calm and her answers mild, showing not the faintest sign that might be read as encouragement. It was an armour made entirely of manners, and the women who taught it to her had, when they were young, learned the same thing as she now was, by watching and being watched. I don't want to paint this too darkly, because not every conversation with a gentleman was a game of strategy. Some men were simply kind, talking easily, asking about the books she read, telling her small, pleasant things about the world. On some evenings the talk flowed naturally, no one on their guard about anything, and the whole room felt only warm. Those were Adelaide's favourite moments, moments when the rules melted away, and two people simply talked as equals about things they both cared for. I think the rules existed not because such moments were impossible, but because they couldn't be guaranteed, and the rules offered a safe footing until the reallys arrived. Beneath all the other rules, there was one more lesson, and it's the one I've thought about most often. A lady was taught that when she wanted to express an opinion, she shouldn't state it as fact. She should say, "I believe," "it seems to me," or "I've heard it so," rather than saying, "the fact is such and such." The difference sounds small. In truth, it isn't. By softening her certainty, she opened a door for others, letting them disagree without feeling attacked. She made her opinion into something that could be discussed, rather than something that had to be accepted whole or flatly rejected. It was a way of holding your ground without holding a weapon. I've found that the more deeply I think about it, the more I feel we could use a little of this wisdom now too. Not cowardice, not erasing yourself, but a kind of care, a willingness to say, "this is what I think," while leaving room for everyone else in the room to stand as well. Adelaide was practicing this. She practiced it at breakfast beside the card tray and the quick exchanges of morning visits. She didn't always manage it. Sometimes her own feelings came out too strongly. A flush crept up her neck, and her aunt's cool glance told her she was being too forceful. Sometimes she drew back so far that she lost her presence altogether, and afterward Mrs. Ashby told her gently that silence too could be a kind of rudeness. She was learning to walk this tightrope, a tightrope that was narrow, and the learning was a long process. But I believe the most important point, and one that the etiquette books of the time didn't often say outright, lies here. The rules of conversation weren't only about words, they were also about expression, posture, and the way a woman held herself while she listened. The wandering gaze, the stifled yawn, the glance toward the window or the clock, all of these carried messages as loud as words, and all of them would be read. Adelaide was learning to keep her attention in the same place as her body, looking at the person speaking to her, as though that person were the only one in the room. And it's a skill that sounds simple, but is anything but. To give another person your full, quiet, undefended attention, even for just a few minutes, is one of the most generous things a person can do. The Victorians wrapped it up in etiquette. Beneath the etiquette, though, there was something genuine. Sometimes I wonder whether Adelaide enjoyed all of this. Not the rules themselves, which could be tiresome, but the thing the rules made possible. A whole room full of people being gentle with each other for a short stretch of time. We have no record of how she felt. No diary survives because she wasn't real, and yet in every small town across England there were girls exactly like her who were real, and their diaries don't contain the thing we wish they did. What survives instead are the guidebooks written by older women for younger ones, and what those books were really saying, between the lines, was this: the world is full of people who can hurt you, and courtesy is the coat you put on against the cold. Learn to wear that coat well, and you might find that underneath the shell the chill isn't as sharp as you feared. In the quiet hours of the night, I sometimes imagine a conversation between Adelaide and one of the ladies she visited on her morning calls. It wasn't a real conversation, of course, because the rules would shape every single sentence in it, but underneath the surface there was another kind of exchange, one that the rules both carried and concealed. Two women, sitting close together in a bright room, chatting about things that didn't matter. The weather, a ribbon, a book of poems, while beneath the words a quieter conversation was taking place. I'm here. I see you. This is pleasant. Let's not be alone. That, I think, is what the rules were really about. Not to keep women stung. Though they did that too, not to make them seem small, though sometimes they did that as well, but to build, out of calling cards and folded corners and carefully counted quarter hours, a way of being together that was safe enough to bear and warm enough to want. The light in the sitting room had shifted. It was the early part of the afternoon now. The morning conversations were over, and the house around Adelaide had gone quiet, like a hand unclenching. Mrs. Ashby had gone off to write her letters. Nellie was somewhere at the back of the house with a dusting cloth. The clock ticked away in the hall. Adelaide sat alone for a while, sunk in the silence that comes after words. A deeper ones that held everything that had been said and everything that had been kept hidden in the heart. She placed her hands in her lap and sat quietly, her thoughts finally her own, and the long afternoon stretched out gently before her, asking nothing of her at all. The door closed behind them, the street opened up ahead, and everything changed. Inside the house, Adelaide moved through rooms she knew, among people she could anticipate, in a world where the walls of themselves were a kind of shelter. And outside, that shelter fell away. The pavement was public. Anyone could watch her. Anyone could judge. The moment she stepped across the threshold, the rules that had already been many indoors suddenly multiplied, because the street was the one place where a woman's conduct was exposed to a crowd she hadn't chosen and couldn't control. It was a bright afternoon in May, the sunlight falling clean across the fronts of the houses along Carrick Crescent. Adelaide walked beside her aunt, and they weren't walking quickly. A lady doesn't hurry in the street. She moved at a steady, unhurried pace, neither dawdling nor rushing, making her way through the town as though she had a purpose but no urgency. Hurrying would look flustered. Dawdling would look idle. The right pace announced, without a single word, that here was a woman who was perfectly at ease. Her carriage had been taught to her as well. She held herself upright, shoulders dropped, head level. She didn't stoop, she didn't slouch, and she didn't let her arms swing loosely at her sides the way a child might. One hand held the handle of her parasol, tilted to keep off the afternoon sun, while the other rested lightly at her waist or held the edge of her shawl. It looked natural, or almost natural, but it was the product of 1,000 tiny corrections made quietly over the years by Mrs. Ashby and by the governesses before her, and by the accumulated pressure of a whole world that watched how women carried themselves and passed judgment on it. I find myself noticing that parasol. It was such a small thing, silk stretched over a light frame, casting a circle of shade no wider than her shoulder. But it was never just a parasol, it was a prop in a certain kind of drama that the street demanded. Held at the right angle, it kept the sun off her face, and, just as usefully, it kept the gaze of strangers off her too. When she passed someone she didn't wish to acknowledge, a tilt of the parasol forward could serve as a gentle screen. It was a kind of armour made of silk, and she carried it as naturally as she carried her own name. Whom to greet and how to greet them was one of the more complicated puzzles of the street. Adelaide couldn't simply smile at everyone she passed, nor could she keep her eyes fixed on the pavement and walk along as if no one existed, because that would be taken for arrogance. As Mrs. Ashby had taught her, the rule went roughly like this. If she saw someone she knew well, she could give a greeting, a slight lowering of the head, accompanied by a calm and confirming look. If the acquaintance was slight, the greeting was slighter still, just a meeting of the eyes and a barely perceptible movement of the chin. If the person was a stranger, she paid them no attention at all. Her gaze would pass over them or through them as though they were walking down a slightly different street. But even within these bounds, there were complications. It wasn't always Adelaide's turn to make the first move. Between a younger woman and an older one, the older spoke first. Between a lady of lower standing and one of higher standing, the higher-ranking woman nodded first. Between a lady and a gentleman, it was always the lady who had to recognise him first. If she didn't, he had to walk past her, pretending he had never seen her face. This small convention gave women a quiet power in the street that they didn't always have elsewhere. A gentleman couldn't force a lady in public to acknowledge that they knew each other. He couldn't raise his hat and expect a response. He had to hold his hat in his hand and wait for her signal. If she chose not to give it, he went on his way, and that was the end of the matter. I think there's an unexpected kindness in this. It meant that a woman could move through public places without being approached by every man who had ever been introduced to her at a party. She held the initiative. She decided who was allowed into her circle and who was kept out, and no amount of charm or persistence on the man's part could override her silence. To us it might seem like a rigid bit of etiquette. To her it was perhaps the only real protection the street had to offer. Like all rules, these cut both ways. If Adelaide saw a gentleman she wanted to greet, a man she liked and had talked pleasantly with over dinner, she still couldn't show too much warmth. A nod was enough, a smile at most, provided it was a discreet one. But stopping in the street for a long conversation, especially with no aunt present, invited talk of another kind, the sort of gossip that travelled from sitting room to sitting room and did a girl no good at all. She could be friendly but not familiar. The distance between those two things was measured in inches, and only experience could teach her to feel it. Walking itself had its own etiquette about position. When Adelaide walked with her aunt, she walked on the inner side of the pavement, closer to the buildings, while Mrs. Ashby walked on the outer side, closer to the road. This was the traditional arrangement. The outer side offered less shelter, closer to the mud thrown up by the wheels, closer to the noise and press of the traffic, and the person walking there was understood to be protecting the person walking inside. When a gentleman walked with a lady, he naturally took the outer side. It was such a habitual gesture that most people no longer thought about what it meant. But when you came down to it, what it meant was protection. Someone stood between her and the rougher side of the world, and that someone was always on her left, always half a step nearer to whatever might happen. If a gentleman Adelaide knew met them on the road and wished to walk with them for a while, there was a procedure for that too. He could offer his arm, but he couldn't simply fall into step beside her without being invited. He had to ask, or at least make his offer clear, and she had to accept or decline, the whole small negotiation carried out in a few calm words, with a look from Mrs. Ashby that said yes or not today. Taking a gentleman's arm didn't announce anything. It was simply the proper thing to do when walking together. But to take it too eagerly, or to take the arm of a man she'd only just met, would look flighty, and that was to be avoided. In certain parts of the street, Adelaide walked with even greater care. Passing a shop window, she wouldn't linger too long, because a lady standing and staring into the window of a draper's shop would be thought to be loitering, or worse, to be greedy. She could glance, but she wouldn't press her face to the glass. If she wanted to go in, she went in briskly, did what she needed to do, and came out. The street was for passing through, not for wandering about. Even standing too long to wait for someone who was late could draw the sort of attention a young woman didn't want to draw. Rather than plant herself on the pavement like a girl with nowhere to go, she was better off pacing slowly back and forth or drawing back into a doorway. She doesn't eat in the street. That seems obvious to us now, almost too plain to bother saying, but this taboo goes far beyond mere fussiness. In the eyes of the world, a lady seen chewing a bun or peeling an orange out in the open is a woman who has forgotten where she is. Food belongs indoors, at a table laid with a cloth, with forks and proper settings. To eat while walking blurs the line between the private body and the public self, and in Adelaide's world that line is as solid and inviolable as any wall. Even a child eating sweets in the street would be thought a little untidy. A grown woman who did the same would be talked about for weeks. If it rained, and in an English May it often did, a fresh set of tiny decisions presented itself. A lady caught in a shower does not run. She might quicken her step. She keeps her dignity, and if the rain came down hard, she would seek shelter in a shop doorway or under an awning and wait for it to pass. If she was lucky enough to have a carriage, the carriage itself was bound by rules of precedence. When two ladies' carriages met on a narrow road, the one whose carriage was lighter, or whose standing was lower, was the one to give way. When a lady stepped down from her carriage, a gentleman might offer his hand to help her, but he wouldn't presume to do so unless invited, and that invitation was only a glance, and her slightly outstretched hand, nothing more. Even the act of stepping from carriage to curb was a small performance, carried out under the gaze of the street, and done gracefully if at all possible. On fine days, the better streets of the little town took on the gentle quality of a promenade, and walking then was no longer merely for exercise. To be seen walking gracefully, in the right company, along the right stretch of road, was itself a social act. Marlow Crescent, where the family lived, had its own little length of promenade, a clean stretch of paving under young lime trees, where the nearby households would come to walk in the early evening. The pace here was slower, because the walking itself was the whole point. Here a nod or a greeting carried more weight, because it happened in full view of everyone, and everyone was quietly keeping the accounts in their heads. When I think of how much vigilance all this required, I feel a slightly weary sympathy for her. Every step she took was watched. Every glance was weighed. Every brief pause in the wrong place could be read into too far. We move through our own streets with a freedom that would have astonished her, and most of us never think about it at all, because we've never known anything else. But Adelaide understood. She had been taught from childhood that the street was a text, that she was always being read, and that the reading wasn't always kind. These rules were meant to help her pass through that reading safely, and it must be said, they were also a cage, however gently it had been gilded. They came to the church. St. Oswald stood a little back from the shopping street, behind a low wall and a row of elms just breaking into their first thick green. The door stood open. Coming in from the bright street, the inside seemed cool and dim, and so the rules shifted again, because a church was thought to be a different kind of public space, one bound not only by manners but by reverence, and the two didn't always sit easily together. A lady enters a church quietly. She never speaks above a whisper. She doesn't turn her head to see who else is there, though of course she notices, because noticing her surroundings is a habit no amount of piety can quite erase. She goes to her seat or her pew and settles herself, her eyes fixed straight ahead, resting on the altar or on her prayer book. She doesn't fidget, she doesn't fan herself, and she smooths her skirts no more than once. The church asked of her a stillness that the drawing room did not, and for a young, restless Adelaide who found a long sermon a kind of torment, that stillness was sometimes the hardest rule of all to keep. The seating followed an order that everyone understood without anyone having to say it. Families of standing had their own pews with doors, and those pews were part of their mark of place, just like the family's own front door. To sit in someone else's pew uninvited, even if no one said a word, would have felt like a trespass. Within the pew, the family were ranged by standing and by age, the head of the household nearest the aisle, the women set further in, the children furthest in of all, so that their little movements drew less notice. Adelaide sat beside her aunt, her hands folded, trying to fix her attention on the sermon, though not always with success. But the church was more than a place of worship. Whether the clergyman liked it or not, it was also a great stage for display. A lady's Sunday dress was one of her finest. Her hat was carefully chosen. Her gloves were brand new. To arrive at church looking anything less than flawless was to fail a test that had little to do with God and everything to do with the neighbours. I suspect that some women gave more thought to what they would wear to morning prayer than to anything the prayer itself contained, and I don't say that to mock them. They lived in a world that treated appearance as a language, and the church was one of the places where the whole town gathered to read that language. To go to church badly dressed was to write a sentence that everyone could see and no one would forget. There is something in all this that is both touching and slightly comic. Careful piety laid over careful vanity. The prayer book opened in a gloved hand that had spent an hour that morning deciding between two ribbons. But I don't think the two things were as sharply separate as they seem. The impulse that made a woman want to look her best before God was the same one that made her want to look her best before her neighbours, and that wish wasn't shallow in itself. It was a way of saying, I take this seriously. I take you seriously. I came here with care, and that care is a kind of respect. When the service ended, the churchyard became, for those few minutes, the most important social space in the town. Here, on the gravel path, between the church door and the outer gate, the whole congregation gathered, broke apart into their separate circles, exchanged greetings, murmured invitations, and finished the little dealings of the week's society under the elms, in full view of everyone. Here it was allowed to speak, to stop and talk, to introduce one friend to another, in a way the street didn't much allow. The church offered this meeting its own particular shelter. Talk in the churchyard was respectable, seen by all, and so safely protected from misunderstanding. Adelaide could stand here and talk with people she might not have spoken to elsewhere, and the talk could be a little warmer, a little longer, because the setting made it seem spotless. It was here that she sometimes saw faces she knew only as names on cards. This was Mrs. Wren, whose card had lain in the tray that very morning. That was old Mrs. Pennington on her stick, who no longer went out into society but still came to church every Sunday. As if without her that fixed seat would feel empty. Now and then there appeared a gentleman whose name she had heard mentioned at dinner, and now he stood in the spring light, real and solid, a little less awe-inspiring than she had imagined. The churchyard made people ordinary. It stripped away some of the stiffness the drawing room lent them. I think Adelaide was grateful for it. Grateful for these few minutes of standing at ease before the walk home wrapped itself around her again. They walked home in the last of the evening light, the shadows longer now, the streets quieter. Mrs. Ashby's step didn't change. Her bearing didn't change. The parasol still held itself at the same precise angle. She moved through the town, the church, and the churchyard, just as she had moved through every public space for the last 30 years, with an ease so practiced it had become invisible, which looked like nature, but was really an art. Adelaide walked at her side, trying to keep in step with her. The same pace, the same straight back, the same calm forward gaze. One day she would no longer need to try. These rules would settle into her body the way they had settled into her aunt's. And she would walk down the street without thinking about how she walked. She would sit still through a sermon without counting the minutes. She would greet an acquaintance at exactly the right depth, needing nothing to guide her but her own instinct. But that day was not today. Today she was still learning. Today the street was still a text she read a little slowly, a little carefully, with the slight anxiety of a student who had studied hard but wasn't quite sure of the exam. The front door opened, the house took them back in, and the public world fell away. Indoors the rules softened. The parasol was folded and set in the stand. The hat came off. The gloves slid from her fingers and were laid beside the silver tray on the hall table. The quiet of the house covered her like a warm towel after cold water. In the cool of the hall, as the door was shut and the street was closed off on the other side of it, for this brief moment she belonged only to herself. The house grew quiet, with the quiet that only an afternoon house has, That particular stillness that comes down when the morning's work is done and the bustle of the evening hasn't yet begun. Mrs. Ashby rested in her room. Nellie had gone to the back passage with her broom. Tom had been sent out on an errand that would keep him busy for an hour. And Adelaide at last came to the hour of the day that was the closest thing she had to being wholly her own. She sat at the writing desk. It was a small piece of furniture, placed beneath the morning room window where the light was best. The desk folded open on hinges to reveal a sloped surface covered in green baize, and below the surface ran a row of little compartments, each holding its own particular treasure. A pot of ink, packed tightly, a tray of pens, their nibs wiped clean after every use, a stick of deep crimson sealing wax lay beside a brass seal engraved with the family's initials, a small knife for trimming a split nib, and in the widest compartment, neatly stacked, sat a pile of writing paper, cream-coloured, its edges even, waiting to be written upon. I want to linger a while at this desk, because in this particular time and place there is something in the act of writing a letter that deserves more attention than we usually give it. We live in a world of instant messaging, a world where a thought is tapped out and sent before it has fully formed in the mind. Adelaide lived in a world where every written word was slow, deliberate and unchangeable, where a letter, once sent, could not be taken back. That slowness changed everything. It meant that what she wrote carried a weight our quick sentences never reach, because she could not unsay what she had said, and the person receiving it would hold it in their hands, read it, perhaps read it again, the paper itself carrying not only her words but the shape of her handwriting, the pressure of her pen, and the faint scent of the room in which she sat to write. The paper itself was chosen with care, and that choosing was an expression of the small kind of taste her world prized. A lady's writing paper was plain, of good quality, cream or white, neither thick nor thin. It had no scent, or if it did, the scent was so faint you could almost only imagine it. It had no colour, it bore no floral pattern, and no gilded edge, because such things were considered too showy, the sort of paper a shopgirl might use, and this distinction of class mattered. Near the top edge of the paper, or on the flap of the envelope, the address of the house might be printed and in a plain small typeface. The paper announced, through its very restraint, that the person using it needed no extra decoration. Her words alone were ornament enough. The pen she used was a steel nib set in a wooden holder, and writing with it meant dipping into ink. This took a certain skill. Too much ink, and the nib would drip, leaving a dark blot that spread across the paper beyond recovery. Too little, and the line would run dry and pale, thin as a thread. The right amount produced a steady, even line, dark enough to read easily, and light enough to look graceful on the page. Adelaide had practised her hand since girlhood, and her writing, if not beautiful, was neat, with a patient and regular shape because she knew that others would judge not only what she wrote, but the way it looked. The etiquette books of the day often repeated one rule: a lady should write as she speaks. This did not mean her letters should chatter or ramble. It meant the tone should be natural, the sentences flowing like conversation, not stiff, not affected, without that pompous formality that makes a letter read like a legal document. Write as though you were sitting beside the person, Mrs. Ashby had once told her. Set down what you would say if you were together in the same room, then read it again, and cut anything that sounds too studied. Easier said than done, as anyone who has ever stared at a blank page knows well. Adelaide now held her pen above the paper before her, ready to write a letter of thanks. 2 evenings ago she had been a guest at a small dinner party at Mrs. Wren's house, and this kindness had to be returned, not with a dinner of her own arranged by her aunt, but with a few lines of gratitude. The letter need not be long. A few sentences would do, but those few sentences had to be pitched just right. Warm without being overdone, grateful without being humble, and written in a hand that did not tremble, did not blot, and did not drag. She began to write. She thanked Mrs. Wren for the evening's hospitality. She mentioned one thing in particular that had given her pleasure, a piece of music that was played, or a dish that was especially fine, so that the thanks would not seem vague and empty. She closed the letter with a wish to see her hostess again soon. In a tone of hope rather than demand, she signed her name. She read it through from the start. She weighed whether the word delightful was too strong, decided it was not, and let it stand. The whole thing took her perhaps 10 minutes, and the letter ran to fewer than 100 words. It would be received, read, undone, and then set aside. As a living thing, its life would be shorter than the time it took to write. But the writing of that letter mattered greatly. Not to write it would have mattered more, because an unwritten letter says as much as a written one. If Adelaide had failed to write her thanks within a day or two, Mrs. Wren would have noticed. Perhaps she would have said nothing, but she would have drawn her own conclusions, either that the evening had not been valued, or that Adelaide's manners were not quite complete, and neither conclusion would do the girl any good. The whole system of correspondence, like the system of calling cards, ran on the principle of mutual attention. You give, you acknowledge receipt, and the acknowledgement is itself a gift, and the cycle turns endlessly, keeping the entire machinery of friendship in motion. Some letters called for more care than a simple note of thanks. An invitation, for instance, was quite a formal thing. It was written in the third person, a convention that sounds strange to our ears, but was perfectly natural to Adelaide. Mrs. Ashby presents her compliments to Mrs. Wren and requests the pleasure of her company at dinner on Thursday next at 7 o'clock in the evening. The third person kept the tone at a certain elevation. It announced that this was no casual matter. This was a formal occasion. The reply came back in the same form. Mrs. Wren accepts with pleasure. Or Mrs. Wren regrets that a prior engagement prevents her from attending. And the whole exchange proceeded in a graceful atmosphere, held at arm's length, as though neither party wished to be seen appearing too eager. I rather admire this economy, the way so much could be said in so few words, and without any of the awkwardness a more personal style might invite. There was no need to explain why you could not come, no need to offer an excuse or an apology. The format itself carried the meaning, and that meaning was understood, leaving no loose ends to embarrass either side. I think we have lost this in our own age of casual invitations, last-minute cancellations, and texts that reply with maybe. I find myself missing the neatness of the old way, though I never lived within it. There were letters harder to write than an invitation. A letter of condolence to a family in mourning was perhaps the most difficult thing a pen was ever asked to do. The words had to be sincere, yet brief, tender, yet restrained, warm enough to be felt and quiet enough not to intrude. Adelaide had not yet been asked to write such a letter, but she had watched her aunt write one, seated at the same desk, with a stillness quite unlike her usual ease, a stillness that came not from discipline, but from true feeling. The letter that came after that long, quiet sitting was very short. It said almost nothing, and yet it said exactly the right thing, precisely because it did not try to say too much. Some sorrows, Mrs. Ashby told her afterward, cannot be soothed by words, and should not pretend to be. Your letter only stands there and says, I know, and I am beside you. That is all it can do, and that is enough. Then there was the letter of introduction, a peculiar currency of the social life Adelaide was only beginning to understand. If a friend were travelling to another town and hoped to be received there, a lady might write a letter introducing her to an acquaintance in that place. The letter was carried by the traveller herself and presented on arrival, a portable recommendation whose meaning ran, I know this person, I vouch for her, and I ask you to receive her as you would receive me. It was a generous act, and not one to be done lightly, because a letter of introduction carried the writer's own reputation with it. If the person introduced later proved unpleasant, forward, or embarrassing in any way, the stain would fall not only on the traveller, but on the woman who had written the letter that opened the door. So Adelaide learned early that to lend your name to another was a serious thing. It was a form of trust committed to ink. Beneath all these particular forms ran a belief seldom spoken aloud, yet deeply felt, that a woman's handwriting was a portrait of her character. Steady, clear, upright writing suggested a writer who was orderly, careful, well-educated and composed. Cramped or scrawled writing suggested the opposite. A blot was a sign of haste, and haste was a sign of a mind not in command of itself. Crossed out words were to be avoided, because they looked like a person changing her mind in public. If Adelaide made a mistake, she did not strike it through and write above it. She took a fresh sheet and began again. A letter that reached its destination should look as though it had been written straight through, without a moment's hesitation, and that small display of calm might have taken 3 drafts to achieve. Adelaide finished her note, folded it carefully, and then reached for the sealing wax. This was a small ritual she enjoyed, and one of the few parts of writing a letter that felt more like a craft than a duty. She held the stick of wax to the candle flame and watched its end soften and begin to drip, a slow dark bead forming at the tip. She let it fall onto the folded edge of the paper, making a little round pool of red, and then she pressed the brass seal firmly down onto it and held it there a moment, until the wax cooled around the impression. When she lifted the seal away, the mark was there, the family initials pressed into the smooth red disc, and the letter was closed, and now it was a finished thing, a sealed and courteous parcel waiting to be carried across the town. The smell of sealing wax was something she had known since childhood. It was warm and faintly sweet, the smell of ritual, the smell of letters sent and received, the smell of small solemnities scattered through the quiet life of a household. I picture her sitting there, the candle burning steadily beside her, the brass seal still warm in her hand, and I think that this is one of those moments when the past reveals itself most fully, and is also most impossible to compare to anything we do now. We do not seal our letters, we do not fold them, we do not wait for wax to cool. The whole physical ritual of correspondence has been stripped away, and with it has gone something I cannot quite name but suspect Adelaide would miss. Some sense of weight, some sense of consequence, some feeling that a message was not merely sent but made, crafted carefully with both the mind and the hand. The envelope had its rules too, though the word envelope does not quite describe what she used. In her day, a folded sheet of writing paper could serve as its own envelope, with the address written on the outside of the folded paper, or it could be tucked into a separate paper wrapper. Either way, the address was written neatly in the centre, and the recipient's name had its own small set of rules. A married woman took her husband's name, as in Mrs. James Wren, and never her own Christian name. An unmarried girl was Miss Marlowe, or, if she had sisters, Miss Adelaide Marlowe, with the eldest using only the bare surname. If you addressed the recipient wrongly, writing the correct Mrs. James Wren as Mrs. Sarah Wren instead, this small error could be taken as a great discourtesy, because it suggested the writer did not know, or did not care, how a woman's name ought properly to be spoken of in the world. That thread which ran silently through every corner of Adelaide's day appeared again, a sense that a woman's name did not quite belong to her alone. On her calling card it was her father's surname. On her letters, one day it would be her husband's. In the church register, it would change. On the envelope there was always someone's initials placed before her name. I do not want to make too much of this, because it was simply the way that world worked, and Adelaide would have thought about it no more than she thought about the direction of the wind. But we can think about it gently, from our own distance, noting its shape, and perhaps feeling the stirring of a certain emotion, not anger. For anger is too harsh a word for this peaceful moment, but a kind of attention, a careful, respectful attention. Before the light began to change, she wrote 2 more letters. One was a short reply to an invitation, accepting in the third person an invitation to tea from a family she did not know well. The other was a letter to a friend in another town, and this letter was longer, warmer and freer, because a letter to a friend was the one place where a lady's pen could slip free of the formal rules. Here she could be herself, or as much herself as ink and paper would allow. She could tell a story, describe a person, confide a little feeling. If she was careful, she could be witty. If she trusted her reader, she could show tenderness. A letter to a friend was the nearest thing Adelaide had to a private room of her own, a space where the rules grew thin, though they never entirely disappeared. Even here she would write nothing she would be ashamed to have read aloud, because letters were sometimes shared, passed around among friends, and a careless line could travel further than she intended. I wonder how many letters she wrote in her life. Surely hundreds, perhaps thousands. And how many survived? Almost none. Thank you notes were read and then thrown away. Invitations were answered and then discarded. Letters to friends might be tied up with ribbon and kept in a drawer for a while, and then, when the drawer was cleared or the friend moved away or the house was sold, they were burned, or lost, or simply forgotten. We know that women like Adelaide were writing letters constantly, because the etiquette books of the time told them to, and the whole system of social life depended on it. But the letters themselves, the real paper, the real ink, the real wax, have almost entirely vanished. What remains is only the instruction to write them, the knowledge that they were once written, and a kind of ghostly warmth, like the heat left behind in a chair after the person sitting in it has risen. The candle by the writing desk had burned a little shorter. The light outside the window had turned from white to gold. Adelaide gathered her finished letters into a small stack, tidied the pen tray, stoppered the ink bottle, and closed the lid of the desk. These letters would go out tomorrow morning, carried by Tom, delivered by hand to the houses where they belonged, and by the afternoon they would be received, read, perhaps answered, and the whole gentle wheel of correspondence would turn another quarter turn. She stood up and stretched, and the room around her was very quiet. The afternoon was nearly spent. Soon the house would come alive again, the business of the evening would begin, and the rules would tighten once more. But for now, in this last quiet moment, there was only the desk, the sealed letters, the faint smell of wax in the air, and a kind of ease that comes from having done a duty well and set it aside for a while. The light was changing now, the long golden afternoon giving way to softer colours, and the house had begun a kind of unusual bustle. Nellie was sent upstairs to lay out Adelaide's evening dress. Tom was sent to Sanley Manor for a final confirmation. Mrs. Ashby ended her rest and came out with the particular air of a woman preparing to inspect many things in a short time. For tonight, Adelaide and her aunt were going out to dinner, and in this world a dinner party was not merely a meal. It was a performance, a ceremony, a thing composed as carefully as a piece of music, and from the moment the guests arrived to the moment they departed, every part of the evening was governed by rules as strict as law. Let us go ahead of them to the house where the dinner will be held and see how the preparations are coming along. Sanley Manor belonged to Mrs. Wren, a lady of comfortable means whose husband had been abroad on business for several years. She kept a high standard of dining in a well-ordered household, and she was known throughout Aldenburgh for her hospitality. She'd invited 8 people to dinner, an easy number to manage, large enough to make the conversation lively, and small enough that no one had to raise their voice. The invitations had been written and sent 2 weeks earlier in the formal third person, and all of them had been accepted, and now the evening had finally arrived, and she still had a great deal to do. Since early in the afternoon, the dining room had been fully given over to preparation. The table was long, of dark wood polished with beeswax until it shone, gleaming with a deep lustre in the light coming through the windows, a shine that Nellie, or a maid much like her, had spent an hour that morning bringing out. Over it was laid a cloth, white, pressed crisp, without a single wrinkle, laid flat and even, with the length hanging down all 4 sides exactly the same. On this cloth the tableware was being set out, and in that era the arrangement of the table had an almost mathematical precision. At each place a dinner plate was set first, squared directly in front of the chair, and on the plate lay a folded napkin, white, lightly starched, folded into one of the tasteful and simple shapes. To the left of the plate went the forks, 2 or 3 of them, arranged in the order they would be used from the outside inward. To the right were the knives, their blades turned toward the plate, and beside the knives the spoons. Above the plate, or a little to the right, were the glasses, one for water, one for wine, and if the dinner was grander, perhaps a third for a second wine. Every piece of silver had been polished until it shone, so bright it was almost dazzling, and every piece was placed with a rigour that would have satisfied a surveyor. The distances between them were equal. The alignment was precise. Standing at one end of the table and looking down its length, you would see a pattern as ordered as a garden flower bed, every element in its proper place, every inch of space carefully considered. I find in the quiet geometry of a well-laid table like this a deep sense of satisfaction. It is a calm that exists purely for the sake of order itself, in objects placed correctly and left as they are, in knowing that every fork and every glass is there for a reason. I think this is the same calm Adelaide felt watching Nellie build the morning fire, a comfort that comes because the world knows its own outline. Most of us do not set our tables this way now, and I do not think we are worse for it. But there was a beauty in the old ways worth attending to, a seriousness about the business of receiving guests that went beyond a mere satisfaction of hunger and moved into something closer to art. At the centre of the table stood the decoration meant to catch the eye, and this was where Mrs. Wren had taken particular care. It might be a silver or glass epergne of several tiers, holding fruit, fresh flowers, and small dishes of sweetmeats, rising from the middle of the cloth like a gleaming little piece of architecture. Or it might be something simpler, a shallow bowl of fresh flowers, chosen to be beautiful, and yet not so tall as to block the guests from seeing one another across the meble. The centrepiece was the hostess's signature. It was the one place on the table where taste could be displayed without restraint, and it announced to the whole room, before anyone had said a word, just what sort of evening this was going to be. Mrs. Wren had chosen well. The flowers came from her own garden, white and pale yellow, full of spring, set low in a cut-glass shallow dish, and they filled the room with a faint fragrance you could only catch when you leaned in close. There were candles too, of course, for the evening light would not last long, and the placing of the candles had been considered with just as much care. They had to give enough light to see by, but not so much that the room looked harsh. The best light for a dinner was soft, the flames reflecting on the silver and the glass, casting a warm and flickering glow over the faces around the table. Candlelight has a kind of magic to it, a sort of kindness it shows to a room. It hides what does not need to be seen. It flatters what deserves to be admired. And it gives the evening a sense of enclosure, a feeling of being shut away from the world outside, a feeling that a brighter light would only spoil. Then came the question of who sat where, and this was no small question at all. Arranging the seating for a dinner was the hostess's most delicate task, and Mrs. Wren had spent the better part of the morning thinking it over carefully. The rule went like this. The gentleman of the highest rank, or the guest being especially honoured, was placed at the hostess's right hand. His wife, or the lady of the highest rank, was placed at the host's right hand, though there was no host in this house, and Mrs. Wren herself took both ends of the table. The rest of the guests were spread along the two sides, man and woman alternating, and it took care to seat people beside those they might talk to easily, and to keep them away from anyone known to be at odds with them. A good hostess was like a quiet diplomat. She read her guests the way a general reads a map, and she placed them where they would do the least harm and the most good. Adelaide, being young and unmarried and not of the highest rank, would be seated somewhere near the middle of the table, beside a gentleman Mrs. Wren had chosen, one who was easy in his manner and willing to talk to a girl without any air of condescension. This was a kindness on the hostess's part that Adelaide might not even notice, for the best seating was the kind that felt natural, as though the guests had simply drifted to their places by instinct. The worst arrangement was the one where you found yourself beside someone with whom you had nothing in common, and the whole evening stretched out before you like a dead end with no way through. When the guests arrived, they were shown first into the drawing room, where they gathered and waited, standing or sitting, with the ease of people who knew this business well. Someone might offer a drink. The talk was light and easy. Then came the signal, not a bell, not a loud announcement, but a quiet word from a servant at the door, and everyone began to move toward the dining room. They went in by order of precedence. The guest of honour offered his arm to the hostess and led her in. The others paired off man and woman, and followed close behind, forming a loose procession that carried them to their places at the table. Adelaide went in on the arm of the gentleman who was to sit beside her Tauda, and as she drew back her chair and sat, she realised the whole room was arranging itself around her in good order, like a piece of music finding its opening chord. If it were you, sitting down at that table for the first time, I think what would strike you most would be that there was so much silver, and so little of it you were sure how to use. 3 forks, 2 knives, a spoon that might be for soup or might be for something else entirely, a small fork set above the plate that you suspected was for the pudding, but you couldn't be certain. The rule was to work from the outside in, taking the outermost piece first and moving inward with each course. And once you knew that, all the mystery fell away. But if you didn't know, and plenty of people did not, the meal could feel like an examination you hadn't studied for, and the fear of reaching for the wrong fork was real and sharp, sitting heavy as a stone in the pit of your stomach. Adelaide knew the rules. She had learned them at home, at her aunt's table, where the silver was laid out in good order, and the dishes came in the proper sequence, exactly as a rehearsal for an evening like this one. But knowing and doing were two different things, and when the first course came, a small flutter of nerves rose in her all the same, and she hoped it did not show on her face. It was soup. It was always soup. The soup was served from a covered tureen set before the hostess, ladled into bowls, and carried to each guest by servants who moved without a sound. Adelaide picked up her soup spoon, the outermost one, just as she had been taught, tipped the spoon away from herself, drawing the soup toward the far side of the bowl rather than toward her own body, and then she lifted it to her lips without a slurp, without blowing on it, without any of the small sounds a person might make without thinking when eating alone. She did not talk while she ate. This was not because she was shy, though she was a little shy. It was the rule as well. You did not speak with food in your mouth. You did not speak with your fork raised. You took a bite, you set the fork down, you said your piece, and then you took another bite. The rhythm of dinner talk was a slow alternation between eating and speaking, and the two things were never allowed to happen at once. It sounds fussy, and it was, until it became habit. But once it became habit, it turned invisible, and it became the only civilized way to eat, and anything else would have felt wrong. The napkin had its rules too. Adelaide unfolded her napkin only partway and laid it across her lap, never tucking it into her collar the way a child might. She used it to touch her lips lightly before drinking, to keep the rim of the glass clean, and she used it gently, pressing rather than wiping, as though even the napkin had to be treated with a certain restraint. When the meal was over, she did not refold it into its original shape, for that would suggest she expected to use the same napkin again. As though she were a regular at some inn, she left it loosely beside her plate, a small thing. But at that table, nothing was ever truly as trivial as it seemed. The servants moved through all of this like a second silent conversation running beneath the first. They served from the left and cleared from the right, or the other way round, depending on the ways of each house, but always the same throughout the whole evening, so that no guest would be startled by a hand reaching in from an unexpected direction. They did not speak unless spoken to. They made no eye contact with the guests. When they brought a dish, they held it steady and low on the guest's left, then waited without moving until the guest had helped themselves, and only then did they move on to the next. A good servant at a dinner was invisible the way gravity is invisible, a force that holds everything in its place and is never seen at work. I find this both admirable and a little unsettling, which is perhaps an honest reaction to a world built so finely on the labour of people trained not to be noticed. The dinner Adelaide was enjoying, the dinner she would remember for its candlelight and its talk and the scent of the flowers, was at the same time a night of hard physical work for those carrying the plates, pouring the wine, standing for hours without ever being allowed to sit. Both of these things were true. They were true at the same time in the same room, and that room had been designed so that only one side of it could be seen. As the courses came and went and the candle burned lower, and the talk found its stride, a kind of warmth gathered in a room like that. At the first course the mood was careful. People were still easing into their comfort, sizing up the ones beside them, testing the water. By the second course, perhaps a roast, or a fish under a pale sauce, the talk had loosened. Laughter came more easily. The way the silver caught the light was different now, too. Warmer, more golden. The faces around the table had softened into that look people get when they are well fed and among friends. Mrs. Wren watched all of this from her end of the table, and this was where the hostess's real work lay. Her task was not to be the most interesting person in the room. It was to make sure everyone else felt interesting. She kept an eye on the guest who had gone quiet and drew them back in with a question. She kept an eye on the talk that grew too heated, and steered it gently elsewhere. She signalled to the servants with a look rather than a word when a plate should be cleared, when a glass should be filled. She ate less than anyone, because she was too busy tending to everyone else, and she made it all look effortless. And that was the most remarkable trick of all. Sometimes I find myself thinking about Mrs. Wren at her own table, in the candlelight, doing this invisible work. And I think she deserves a kind of admiration we do not often give to hostesses. It is not glamorous work. It is not a stage for showing off talent or courage. It is work about attention, about passing along small kindnesses so naturally that no one notices, work in which a woman holds a whole room together by the quiet power of her care. We have a word for it now. We call it emotional labour, and we have begun rightly to notice how often it falls on the shoulders of women and how rarely it is thanked. But the thing itself is very old. Mrs. Wren would have had no word for it. She would have simply called it giving a dinner. There were things Adelaide could never do at the dinner table, and the list was longer than you might think. She couldn't reach across another person's plate to take something. She couldn't take butter from the buttered dish with her own knife. She couldn't pick her teeth, couldn't touch her hair, and couldn't rest her elbows on the tablecloth. She couldn't refuse a dish too firmly because that might embarrass the hostess who had chosen it. And she couldn't accept too eagerly either, because greed was as poor a showing as fussiness. If a dish wasn't to her taste, she was to take a small portion and leave it on her plate without any comment. If she spilled something, she wasn't to make a fuss, but to let a servant deal with it quietly, as though nothing had happened at all. The table was a stage, and on the stage composure was everything. When the dinner itself was over, when the last course had been cleared away and the dessert, usually light fruit and a few small sweets, had been set out, the moment that belonged entirely to the ladies arrived. The hostess rose, and the ladies rose with her, and they left the gentlemen at the table with their wine and their talk, and then the ladies withdrew to the drawing room where the coffee was ready and the fire had been built up, and the evening turned into a different key. The custom seems a little strange now, separating the guests by sex, sending the women away while the men stayed seated. But it had its own logic. The drawing room after dinner was the women's territory. Here the talk could be freer and softer, less constrained by the presence of men. Here the real news was exchanged, secrets were shared, and alliances were quietly built and mended. Adelaide followed her aunt in through the door, and in the moment of entering she felt the room around her change, felt the air grow easy and the voices drop low, and without being told she understood that in this small, dimly lit room the real evening was only just beginning. After a while the gentlemen came through. Their arrival changed the mood of the room again. The pace picked up a little, chairs were moved, and a new voice or two joined the conversation the women had been carrying on. Coffee was offered again. Someone sat down at the piano, not to perform, but to let a thread of music drift quietly into the room, the gesture done so casually that the melody seemed only to be passing by. The guests moved into the last, easiest part of the evening. The part had no fixed form and no rules except the simplest one, which was this: stay pleasant and let the evening come gently to a close. Adelaide watched Mrs. Wren move through these final hours with the same quiet, even manner she had shown all evening. A word to one guest, a smile to another, a hand laid lightly on a friend's arm. She didn't sit still for long. She moved gently through the crowd, making sure no one was left out, making sure the whole room felt properly looked after. This was the last act of her long performance, and she carried it off beautifully, and never once let it look like a performance at all. The candles in the dining room were burning low now, and the tablecloth was left with the small stains and creases of a good gathering. The silver would be gathered up and washed by hands the people at the table would never see. The flowers would be cleared away, the cloth would be folded, the room would return to its quiet daytime self. But now, in the drawing room, the evening was still alive. The coffee was hot, the fire was bright, and the long, careful ceremony of the dinner was near its end, settling gently behind them like a wave that had spent its strength on the shore. The drawing room at Sanley Manor, when it was used in the evening to entertain guests, was a very different room from the one Adelaide had sat in that morning during her morning call. The same chairs stood in the same places, the same curtains hung at the same windows, but now the lamps were lit and the fire burned high. and the whole room had a warmth and an intimacy it hadn't had by day. There were 8 or 10 people here, sitting or standing with the easy comfort of people who had eaten and drunk well. Adelaide sat among them too, her hands folded in her lap, with a feeling that had stayed with her all evening, that the real performance of the night was about to begin. The drawing room after dinner was the stage where a young woman's accomplishments met their truest test. Not at the table, where she only had to eat correctly and talk easily. Not in the morning call, where she only had to sit, nod, and leave at the right time. In this warm, flickering room she might be asked to do something, to play, to sing, to show what she had learned, and the invitation was both an honour and a trial, and the manner in which she met it would be remembered. The piano stood quietly in a corner of the room, a square piano of dark rosewood, its lid propped open, its keys glinting in the lamplight. It was the most important piece of furniture in the room that night, though it pretended not to be. Earlier, while everyone was drinking coffee, someone had already played for a little while. Some light pieces that filled the room with melody without demanding attention. But that had been only a prelude. The real music of the night was the music that was asked for, and the asking was itself a delicate art. The hostess, Mrs. Wren, would make the request. She knew which of her guests could play and which could not, which would be glad to be asked and which would dread it, and she handled it with the same quiet diplomacy she brought to arranging the seats at the table. She would never ask those known to suffer under such a request. She wouldn't let a poor player make a fool of herself in front of everyone. She timed her request so it came early enough to give the other person time to settle her nerves, and late enough that the room had grown warm and easy, and the listeners were ready to be forgiving. Miss Beatrice Ellery was the first to be asked, and this was no accident, because Beatrice played well, knew it herself, and enjoyed being heard. She was about Adelaide's age, perhaps a year older, fair-haired, unhurried, with the particular confidence of someone who's been praised for a skill so often that the confidence has become a second skin. She went to the piano without any coyness, settled herself on the stool, arranged her skirts, and let her hands hang above the keys for a moment, and the whole room, by an instinct rehearsed 1,000 times, fell silent. She played a nocturne, a gentle, unhurried piece, the kind that can fill a room without seeming to crowd it. Her touch was clean and neat. Her phrasing was sure. She didn't play loudly because the drawing room wasn't a concert hall. And the music here was for people a few feet away, not to be thrown to the back row of a box. The best drawing room playing is intimate, something shared between the player and the dozen or so people around her, and it needs a restraint that might drive a concert hall pianist mad. The display of technique isn't the point. Feeling is. Beatrice had feeling, though she carried it lightly, and the whole room listened, the fire crackling softly beneath the music. And for those few minutes she held the evening in the palm of her hand. I find myself thinking about the long years behind that quiet performance, the years of practice, the mornings she would rather have spent doing something else but had to spend at the keys, the teacher who corrected her fingering, who made her play the same passage over and over until it ran smoothly. All the effort, all the patience distilled into a few minutes of music in a warm room on a spring evening, and no one in the room was thinking of what it had once cost. They were simply lost in the sound, and that, I think, is exactly as it should be. Art hides the labour. But the labour was real, and it was long, and it had begun when Beatrice was very small, because accomplishments aren't something a girl can easily pick up in a single season. They are the foundation she builds herself on year after year, like a house raised brick by brick, and by the time she sat at the piano in Mrs. Wren's drawing room, she had been under construction for 10 years. These things called accomplishments were a special kind of education, and it is worth understanding what they were and what they were not. A young woman of Adelaide's class was expected to be able to play the piano, at least passably. If her voice allowed it, she was expected to sing. She was expected to draw, or to paint in watercolours, well enough to produce a pleasing sketch. She might learn a little French, a little Italian, enough to read a simple book or follow a conversation. She might learn embroidery, fine needlework, the making of the little ornaments that filled the shelves of a well-run house. She was also expected to dance, and we'll come to that later. All of these were called accomplishments, And the word itself is worth weighing because this didn't mean the kind of achievement we think of. An accomplishment wasn't a professional skill. It wasn't a way of earning a living. It was a way of being pleasing, a way of filling a room with delight, a way of making oneself into someone others wanted to be near. In the plainest terms, it was a way of making oneself marriageable. I don't say this to belittle it. The music Beatrice played was real music. The pleasure it gave was real pleasure. The skill was genuine too, but the reason she was taught these things, the reason her parents paid for lessons and a governess oversaw the practice, wasn't that anyone expected her to become a concert hall pianist. It was that a girl who could play well was a girl who had been well brought up, and a girl who had been well brought up was a girl who could be trusted, and a girl who could be trusted was exactly the girl a man might want to marry. An accomplishment was not only a skill but a signal. It said, this family took pains. This girl has been carefully looked after. She is worth knowing. Adelaide could play the piano too, though not as well as Beatrice. She knew this, and it didn't trouble her much, because she had other strengths. A quiet focus, a way of listening that made people feel truly heard, and in a drawing room that served her better than any dazzling run of arpeggios. But listening to Beatrice play, she was keenly aware of the distance between them, and she noticed how the whole room responded to that skill. In the private depths of her own heart, she found herself wondering whether, on an evening like this, she too might be asked to play. And if she were, what on earth she would do. The answer, once it came, had its own rules. If the hostess asked her to play, she must never refuse too quickly, for that would seem false or rude. But she couldn't accept too eagerly either, for that would look like showing off. The correct response was a modest reluctance, a gentle suggestion that her playing wasn't worth hearing, and then a calm acceptance when the request came a second time. The exchange itself was like a small dance for two, and everyone in the room understood it was a performance, and no one minded, because the alternative would be far worse. A girl who heard a single word and rushed to the piano, or one who flatly refused and left the hostess with an awkward silence to fill. If she really were to play, she'd have to choose a piece well within her ability. Nothing too hard, nothing where mistakes came easily. A simple piece played cleanly and with feeling was worth far more than a showy piece played badly. And when she finished, she'd rise from the piano bench without a trace of lingering, not waiting for praise, returning to her seat as though the whole thing had been a trifle, hardly worth mentioning. Accomplishment, like so much else in her world, was meant to look effortless. The effort must always be hidden away. There was, in the same way, an etiquette of listening, and Adelaide knew it inside and out. When someone played or sang, the whole room gave its attention. Conversation stopped. Faces turned toward the performer. No one whispered, no one fidgeted, no one glanced at the clock. Even if the playing was poor, even if the song was badly chosen, the listeners still sat quietly, wearing an expression of polite interest. And when the piece ended, they applauded warmly, because to do otherwise would wound a person who had made themselves vulnerable, and that kind of cruelty was something the drawing room could never forgive. I find this one of the loveliest rules of the evening, and one of the most humane. It protected the performer. It seemed to say, we asked you to do this, and whatever the quality, we'll honour what you gave. In a world that judged so constantly and without rest, these few minutes of music turned the drawing room into a safe harbour. You could play badly and still be thanked. You could sing off key and still receive a smile. The applause was a kind of contract. We won't hurt you for trying. That contract was almost always kept, because everyone in the room knew their own turn might come next. Beatrice finished her nocturne. The whole room broke into applause. She rose and returned to her seat with exactly the right measure of modesty. A slight nod, a calm smile, and the room's attention shifted and eased as conversation rose once more. Someone asked whether she might play again later, and she said she'd be glad to, and that small promise hung in the air like a gift waiting to be unwrapped. Just then, fans appeared in several hands about the room. It was a warm evening, the fire burning brighter than the season strictly demanded, and the fans swayed with a slow, easy rhythm that was almost hypnotic to watch. In that era, a fan was more than a tool for cooling oneself. It was a companion, an accessory, almost an extension of the hand that held it. A lady carried it wherever she went in the evening, and she used it not only to fan herself but to punctuate her conversation, to veil her expression, to create a tiny private space between herself and the person she spoke with in a crowded room. Behind the fan, whispers could be exchanged. Above the fan, a glance could be passed and received. It was a small screen, no wider than a palm, yet it could serve as a door. Some claimed the fan had a language of its own. A closed fan resting against the right cheek meant yes, against the left cheek meant no. A fully opened fan was a declaration, and a fan snapped shut was a warning. I'm not sure how much of that was real, and how much was invented afterward by people who loved games of secret codes, but the fan itself was real, and the way it swayed in a woman's hand was watched by all, and reading its movements was one of the small arts of the evening, something no book of manners could ever fully teach. Adelaide held her fan loosely, opening and closing it without thinking, and she was looking across the room at a man she had noticed once or twice that night, Mr. Edwin Hale. He had been speaking easily with the older gentleman, and now he stood before the fireplace with a cup of coffee in his hand, his manner suggesting he was at ease in a room like this, yet not bound by it. She wasn't staring. She wouldn't have dared even to think of it. But she had noticed him, and the notice rested quietly within her, unspoken and unacted upon, a small warmth she didn't examine too closely, for she had been taught that examining such a feeling was unwise. Of Mr. Hale I can say only this much tonight. He stood by the fireplace. She sat at the other end of the room. Between them lay the flickering light, the sound of someone laughing softly, and the whole intricate framework of manners that her world had built up between young men and women, and neither of them crossed it, and the evening flowed onward. Someone was singing now, a lady Adelaide didn't know well, about the same age as Mrs. Ashby, and her voice wasn't exactly beautiful, but it was true, and she was singing an old folk ballad, simply without accompaniment, standing beside the piano with her hands folded before her. The room listened with the same polite stillness it had given Beatrice, and the singing filled the space between the walls the way water fills a bowl. Adelaide felt, as she always did when she heard someone sing well in a quiet room, a loosening in her throat, an almost physical resonance, as though her own body wanted to join in, yet knew perfectly well it was better not to try. The night had grown late, and the gathering was about to break up, and this departure had its own quiet choreography too. One guest rose and went to the hostess to take her leave. She didn't announce her departure to the whole room. She spoke softly, thanked the hostess, and slipped away. Others followed, one after another, or in pairs, and the room slowly emptied the way water in a cup is sipped down to nothing. Mrs. Ashby was among the last to leave, for she had the privilege of an old friend and was in no hurry, and Adelaide waited quietly at her side with a pleasant weariness, the whole evening resting in her body like a supper she was still digesting. The farewell was brief, a handshake, a soft word of thanks, a promise to call again soon. There was no lingering at the door, for the evening had ended, and the rules said so, and in a world that knew when things ought to end and let them end naturally, this was exactly right. Outside, the air was cool and the stars were out. The town had settled into quiet, that particular stillness a small town has. The respectable hours of activity over and only the hours of the night watch remaining. Adelaide and her aunt walked home through the darkness, their steps steady on the pavement. They didn't say much. The evening had given them words enough for one day. In the silence between them there was a sense of companionship, an understanding that needed no words, a shared knowing that it had been a fine evening, and that in a room full of people everyone had been gentle with one another for those few hours. When they arrived, the house was dark. Nellie had left a single lamp burning in the hall. The silver tray was empty, the cards long since cleared away. The writing desk was closed. The morning room was cold. The whole house waited to be brought back to life tomorrow. And from the first light of dawn to the last candle put out, everything would be kept in the same careful order by those same quiet hands. Adelaide went upstairs to her room. She unfastened the buttons of her gloves. She let down her hair. The comb moved slowly through it. The same comb, the same mirror, the same quiet motion. Many hours before, in the first faint light of morning, she had begun the day with these very same gestures. The day had come full circle. All the rules that had carried her through it, the rules of the cards, the rules of the street, the rules of the table and the drawing room, the thousands of tiny instructions no one had ever written down, yet everyone expected her to know. All of them now settled gently into the quiet of the room, and they no longer felt like rules at all. They felt like the outline of a life, and within that outline, in this brief stillness before sleep, there was room enough for a girl to be herself, if only until the coming of the dawn. The assembly rooms at Oldenburg were not grand, not by the standards of Bath or London, certainly not, but on an evening lit with candles, the floors freshly waxed, the band tuning up in the gallery above the door, they became something quite remarkable. The tall windows caught and held the candlelight. The polished floor gleamed like dark pooled water. The air was full of beeswax, warm bodies, and the faintest scent of flowers, and the whole room hummed with a certain special energy for the thing that was about to begin. Adelaide stood near the entrance with her aunt, wearing the best gown she owned, a long dress of pale silk with a modest neckline and sleeves that gathered just above the elbow, leaving the nearly shoulder-length white gloves to show. Her hair had been arranged more carefully than usual, pinned up and smoothed down, fixed with only a single small ornament, nothing too elaborate and nothing too showy, because a girl at her first ball was meant to look fresh and young and unadorned. Wearing no jewellery was itself a kind of statement. It said, "I don't need to dress myself up, I am enough as I truly am." Adelaide stood there in her pale silk, her heart beating much faster than she would have liked, and whether she truly believed those words inside was another matter entirely. In her gloved hand she held a small object, a dance card no larger than a playing card, bound in thin cardstock, with a little pencil tied on by a ribbon. Printed on the cover were the names of the dances to be played that night, one to a line, each title with a blank space beside it. That blank space was there to be filled with names, the names of the gentlemen who asked her to dance, written by her own hand or by theirs, a small running record of the night's partners. The dance card was an object managed as carefully as any letter or calling card, and it carried its own weight of meaning, its own small politics, and a quiet power to make a girl feel chosen or forgotten. Let me linger on the dance card for a moment, because it is one of those things that seems trivial and yet matters enormously. A full card was a triumph. It meant every dance was accounted for, that enough gentlemen had sought her out and asked for the honour, and that she would spend the evening in motion, turning from one partner to the next with no gaps at all. A blank card, or a card with too many empty lines, was the opposite, plain proof that she had been overlooked, and that visibility was the worst part because the card was right there in her hand where anyone could see it. A girl couldn't hide a blank card, she could only hold it lightly and pray that no one looked too closely. The asking usually happened early, often before the first dance began, and it was always the gentleman who did the asking, never the lady. A man would step forward, bow, and ask whether a certain dance was free. If she was free and willing to dance it with him, she would tell him which one, and then he would write his name beside it, or she would write it for him, and the bargain was struck. After that, she couldn't promise that dance to anyone else. She couldn't change her mind. The pencil mark was a small promise, and at a ball, promises had to be kept. But a girl could refuse, and refusing had rules of its own. She could say that a dance was already taken, whether or not it truly was, one of the few social lies the evening allowed. But if she refused a gentleman by saying a dance was taken, she then couldn't dance that same dance with anyone else, because the first gentleman would see it, would know he had been deceived, and the offence would be a serious one. Once refused, that dance was locked. She would either sit and watch or dance with no one at all, and the card was the witness to that empty space. I find this both clever and a little merciless. The dance card kept everyone honest. It made the choices of the evening visible, traceable, accountable. A girl couldn't openly play favourites without being caught. A gentleman couldn't press too hard without being noticed. The whole silent market of attraction and preference and avoidance was written in pencil on a piece of card no bigger than a palm, and at the end of the night the card told its own small story. A story of who wanted whom, and who was wanted, and who stood watching from the edge of the floor. The music began. The band was small, a few strings, a piano, perhaps a flute. Nothing grand, but the sound filled the whole room and gave it a shape it hadn't had before. The first dance was usually a quadrille, a dance of squares and formations, 4 couples at a time moving through the set steps everyone had learned, with room enough between the figures for conversation. It was a social dance, not a passionate one. The steps were measured, the pace was moderate. The talk between figures was easy too, a few words exchanged in the pauses of the music, a remark about the room, a compliment about the evening, nothing that would be awkward to say in front of a stranger. Adelaide danced with a gentleman whose name was already written on her card, a man she had met once before at a dinner party, agreeable but not exactly interesting, who guided her through the figures skillfully enough but with no real grace. She followed without effort, because she had been taught how to follow, because the dancing master who had come to the house twice a week for 2 years had made sure of it, and because the steps of the quadrille were not truly that hard. The hard part was making it look effortless, and looking happy at the same time, and talking easily at the same time, and remembering her place in the formation at the same time, and not stepping on anyone's hem at the same time, and looking at the gentleman with just the right amount of warmth, no more and no less. The dance was a performance of effortlessness, and that effortlessness took the greatest effort of all. Between 2 dances she returned to her aunt, and this was where the quiet time of the ball was spent, in the hours when no dancing was required, when a girl and her chaperone stood or sat watching the room and being watched by it. Mrs. Ashby was her anchor. She didn't dance, hadn't for many years, but she watched everything, and her watching was a form of protection. A girl with a chaperone meant that her conduct was witnessed and, by implication, vouched for. The chaperone was saying silently, "I am responsible for her. She is not alone. Whatever happens to her tonight happens under my eye." Later there would be a waltz, and the waltz was another thing entirely. It was closer than the quadrille, faster, more intimate. The gentleman's hand rested at her waist. The music turned, and they turned with it, and the edges of the room blurred, and for those few minutes there was nothing in the world but the music, the movement, and that strange formal closeness of 2 people moving as one. The waltz had once been controversial precisely because of that closeness. Some thought it improper, a man's hand placed on a woman's body in full view of everyone, and even now the argument hadn't entirely died away. But the waltz had won, the way pleasing things usually do, and Adelaide danced with her eyes slightly lowered, her back straight, her hand resting lightly on the gentleman's shoulder, and the whole dance was over in a few minutes, leaving behind a warmth she didn't quite know where to put. I want to notice the gloves. She hadn't taken them off all night. She wouldn't take them off. The long white gloves were part of a ball's dress, and their purpose went beyond beauty. They were a barrier, a second sin, a layer of fabric between her and the hand of every man she danced with. When he took her hand to lead her onto the floor, he didn't touch her skin. He touched kid leather, smooth and cool and impersonal. When his hand rested at her waist, it rested on silk and whalebone, not on the body beneath. The whole elaborate structure of the evening dress, the gloves, the corset, the layers upon layers of fabric, was an architecture of distance, a way of coming near a man's body without ever truly coming near. The rules of the dance permitted the closeness. The clothing preserved the separation. And wrapped in all of it, Adelaide danced, and felt the music, and bloomed with youth. There was supper during the ball, served in a room connected to the dance floor. The guests filed in at the appointed time and sat down to a meal lighter than dinner. Cold meats, salads, small pastries and ices. It was food that could be eaten quickly and without ceremony, because supper was only a pause, not the main event. The seating was less formal than at a dinner party. People could choose their places fairly freely, though a gentleman who took a lady into supper was expected to attend to her throughout the meal, to see that she wanted for nothing, and to talk with her with the same easy attention as during a morning call. It was a short, easy interlude, and Adelaide was grateful for it, because she finally had a chance to sit down, to rest her feet, and to eat something cold and sweet. Time passed. The candles burned lower. The band played on, but the pace had slowed, and the dancing was gentler now, and the room had that particular feeling of a party past its peak, moving into its last quiet stretch. Some of the guests had already gone. The older ones had left after supper. The younger ones stayed, because for them the night was still lovely, even when the room's own evening had grown old, and because once a ball has hold of you, it is hard to pull yourself away. Adelaide had learned one rule early, and it governed the dance card more strictly than any other. She must never dance more than 2 dances with the same gentleman. To do so would be to announce to the whole room, as plainly as if she had said it aloud, that she favoured him, and once that announcement was made, it couldn't be taken back. 2 dances were allowed, 3 dances were a declaration. The rule existed, like so many others, to protect her, to keep her from revealing too much before she was ready, and to keep a gentleman from asking too much before he had the right. It also kept the whole evening moving. If a girl couldn't be monopolised, she would be shared, and sharing meant more people dancing, more people talking, the whole room kept in motion. The rule was a kindness to the shy gentleman who might not work up the courage to ask, and a restraint on the bold one who might ask too often. When supper was announced, the gentleman marked on Adelaide's dance card for the last dance before supper was expected to offer her his arm and escort her in. This was not merely a formality. This supper partner was, during the meal, her protector and attendant, responsible for making sure she felt comfortable, ate well, and was never left out. It was a small honour, and it was something people noticed. Those in the room would take note of who took whom into supper, and such a pairing would be read as a kind of signal, or a kind of beginning, or at the very least a sign of favour. Adelaide walked in on the arm of a gentleman with whom she had talked happily during the quadrille, and she was glad of it. A gladness that was small, warm, and entirely her own. There was a rule about leaving too, and this one was simpler. Guests departed without any fanfare. She would not say goodbye to the whole room. She found the hostess, thanked her quietly, and then left. If she had enjoyed herself, she would say so briefly. If she had not enjoyed herself, she would still say so, because pretending to have had a good time was the last small courtesy the evening asked of her, and giving that courtesy cost nothing at all. The hostess, who had stood and smiled and managed for hours, accepted the thanks graciously and watched the guests go, and the room closed behind her the way water closes over a stone. Mrs. Ashby touched Adelaide's arm, and that touch meant it was time to go. They found Mrs. Pennington, the hostess who had given this ball, standing by the door, looking as steady and composed as she had 4 hours earlier, though she must surely have been exhausted. The thanks were brief. The farewell was warm. Then they came to the hall, retrieved their coats, and then they came outside into the cool of the night. And as the great door swung slowly shut, the music faded away behind them. I imagine Adelaide, whether she rode home in a carriage that night or walked, and I think her tiredness was a tiredness of a particular kind. It was the tiredness of a body that had danced, of a mind that had stayed alert for hours, of a self that had been on display all evening, and now, at last, she could let down her guard and rest. Gloves came off in the dark, hairpins came out of her hair. That little dance card was still in her hand or in her pocket, with those names written on it, the small history of the evening recorded in pencil, who had asked and who had accepted. That card would be kept, at least for a while, in a drawer or a box, together with the cards from all the other balls, becoming a paper archive of candle-lit evenings. Were these balls worth it? Were those rules worth the trouble of learning? All those hours of dancing lessons, the anxiety over the dance card, and the endless small labour of trying to look effortless? I think they were worth it. For Adelaide they were, though she might not have put it in these words. The ball gave her something no other place could give. It gave her music, movement, the feeling of a whole room of people moving to the same rhythm, and the rare and fleeting permission to come close to another person's body without shame. For a few hours, it gave her a world that was beautiful, orderly and warm, a world in which, for all the strictness of its rules, the rules themselves were like a dance, a way of moving through the night without falling, without stumbling, without getting hurt. The town was very quiet now. The last carriages had gone. The assembly rooms were dark. A dog barked somewhere, and then all was still again. Adelaide was home, and the house took her in as it always did, with the smell of a cold hearth, the ticking of the clock in the hall, and the single lamp Nellie had left burning on the table. She went slowly up the stairs, holding the banister, and in her room she took off the careful costume of the evening, the dress, the gloves, the hair, and that small bright piece of jewellery. She put each thing in its proper place because even now, even at the very end, there was order in this, and order was a kind of comfort. She lay down. The sheets were cool, the house was silent, outside the town was sleeping, and the assembly rooms stood empty, the wax of the ballroom floor worn into marks by the hundreds of feet that had danced there that night, and never again would exactly the same steps fall in that place. Tomorrow the floor would be swept, the candle ends cleared away, the flowers taken out, and the room would return to being an ordinary room, waiting to be given a meaning beyond itself once more. But that was for tomorrow. Tonight there was only this, the quiet of a house at rest. The fading memory of the music, that little dance card in the drawer by the bed, and a girl of 19, lying in the dark, in a world of rules she had not chosen and could not change, finding in the stillness between one day and the next a peace that belonged only to her. The day was over, the house had grown quiet, Adelaide was asleep, and those rules had fallen asleep along with her, folded into the silence of a life they had shaped but never quite managed to define. As we have walked through this day together, I have kept thinking about the women who lived within these rules but left no trace behind. Not Adelaide, who was invented, but the real ones. Thousands upon thousands of girls sitting at real writing desks, holding real dance cards, learning through one careful morning after another how to move through a world that watched them constantly and forgave them rarely. Most of them are gone now, silently and without a sound. Their cards were thrown away, their letters were burned. Their names survive only in a parish register, or on the flyleaf of a book that no one reads anymore. And yet they once lived, fully and completely in a world that was as real to them as ours is to us, and the rules that bound them in the end were not so very different from the rules that bind us now. We too are watched. We too are read. We too learn every single day how much of our true selves to show and how much to quietly fold away and hide. I do not know whether Adelaide would envy us our freedom or whether she would pity us our lack of shelter. Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. She lived in her own time, and she lived it as well as she could, and that was not without meaning. Fires were lit, cards were left, letters were sealed and sent, dances were danced, and in between all of it, in the small gaps the rules never quite reached, she was simply herself, whatever that meant, in a world that did not often ask. If any of this has stayed with you, if some small corner of Adelaide's day has landed somewhere that feels true to you, I would love to hear about it. You're welcome to leave a few words below, whatever comes to you, a thought, a feeling, or where you are listening tonight. There is no need to reach for the right answer. Whatever you leave will reach me, and I will read it, and I will be grateful for it. This is the Dull History for Sleep, and what we do here is simple. We tell stories, slow, quiet, old stories, stories of times and places that most of the world has forgotten. And we tell them in the dark, for anyone who needs a gentle voice at the end of a long day. We have been to medieval kitchens and Victorian drawing rooms, to servants' rooms and ballrooms, and we will go further still to ancient cities and distant centuries, wherever there are lives worth telling and nights worth filling. If you have found something here that helps you rest, we warmly welcome you to subscribe so that the next story can find you when you need it. We are growing slowly, and we are grateful for every single person who walks with us. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for listening. I hope these rules have not left you too weary, and I hope that what stays with you is not their harshness, but the quiet and lasting kindness that was sometimes hidden within them. The way a world full of watching could also be a world full of care. Good night and sweet dreams.